Hi, I'm Pastor Theron. Welcome to Story Sermons, relating life's experiences to the Bible. I'd like to tell you a story. Today's story is a special story. It's special to me because it's part of my story. It's part of my story of the struggle that I had waiting, that I still struggle with waiting for God's timing, waiting for all of the particulars to work themselves out. Part of the struggle for me, waiting. But there's a time for everything. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 1, the Bible tells us, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. In Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5 and verse 6, he says, at just the right time. At just the right time. And in Paul's letter to the Galatians, in chapter 4 and verse 4, he says, when the time had fully come, or in another version it says, in the fullness of time, God. God's timing and God's economy are not always our timing and our economy. We want everything to happen immediately, right now, real fast. And we forget that life is not a sprint but a marathon. And we've got to continue each day going through the steps and going through the lessons and taking in the blessings and learning the lessons of God. Part of my story goes like this. I got saved in December of 1993 while I was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, while on active duty with the Army. But that's another story for another day. After I finished my time in the Army, I got out, got married, and moved to my home state of Idaho, where we attended church as a family. And in May of 1996, I felt led to be a preacher. I didn't understand it at the time, but the call was very strong upon my life. I went up, I talked to the pastor, a man by the name of Monty Holloway, and he was very gracious to me. I preached my first sermons in July and in August of 96. In October, moved to Louisiana. And for Easter of 97, I preached another message, an Easter service. I was brand new, didn't know much of anything, but I got up there and gave it my very best shot. I was licensed to the gospel ministry in June of 1998. And the church that I belonged to was so sure of my calling and so sure of God's promise that we all just expected my first church to be coming along any time. I started filling in at different churches even more than I had been. I filled in, what's called supply preaching, just all over the place, different churches, all over the area, following the calling. Moved to New Orleans and started attending seminary in January of 2001 and graduated in December of 2003. Filled in not only in the area but all over the state, all over other states. Lots and lots of supply preaching and filling in. Churches would call me in view of a call. Hey, we need a pastor even. You might be the guy. Again, another story for another day. All the while waiting for this first church to come along. I was told that churches often recruit young preachers out of seminary to help them grow and mature. And so all the while I was waiting. Didn't have a job, was looking for a job, but I was waiting for that church to be my job. So much so that as our budget started getting very, very difficult and running out of money, I called my mentor at the time, a man by the name of Johnny Johnson, a great man of God. And I said to him, man, I don't know what to do. We're running out of money and I can't pay the bills. What do I do? He said, what do you do? He said, you get a job, boy. I said, what kind of job? I'm waiting for a church to call me. He said, just any kind of a job. Get a job, take care of your family. So that's what I did. I got a job. All the while, waiting. All the while, almost every weekend, going to a different church, filling in. I had a church outside of New Orleans in a small town called Bush. I loved this church. I loved the location. I loved the people. I was sure that was going to be my first church. It wasn't. Another story for another day. There was a church in Mississippi in a town called Hazelhurst. They wanted me. They invited me. Hey, come be our pastor. I didn't feel right about it. And so I turned it down. And by December of '03, when I graduated, everything went silent. There not even any more opportunities to preach. It was the strangest thing to me. We were so unsure of what to do next, and we couldn't stay in our apartment any longer. They were going to tear the building down. We had to leave. We had to go somewhere else. Didn't know where to go. Didn't know what to do. Went back to Idaho for a few months, and I filled in supply preaching again. In fact, at that point in time, for the few months we were up there, I was pastoring 2 churches simultaneously, one in Craigmont and one in Cottonwood, out on the prairie. Did that for a number of weeks and returned to Louisiana, all the while waiting for my first church to call me full time. Not knowing what to do, I started looking for a job. And I worked several different jobs. I struggling, waiting, all the time, waiting. But nothing was happening. Or so I thought. Desperation began to set in, and I began looking at becoming a hospital chaplain. I was learning to be an Army chaplain. Thought maybe I'd become a hospital chaplain. I called up a hospital and I said, hey, what do I need to do to be a hospital chaplain? They said, you need CPE. I said, what's that? They said, we don't know, but you have to have it. Go look it up. So I did. CPE is Clinical Pastoral Education. It's a hospital chaplain internship. Another story for another day. That was a life-changing experience for me. I highly recommend it. While in CPE, everything started to unravel in a good way. Started coming together, unraveling the mysteries, I think I would say. My paperwork was signed to become the Army chaplain officially. I was invited to deploy. I didn't know what to do next, so I went home for a week, tried to find a job, couldn't find one, and within that week, Hurricane Katrina hit. That was my baptism by fire as an Army chaplain. Another story for another day. All the while, I'm waiting, but now I'm distracted. And in the midst of all of this, I kept wondering where life was taking me. I kept wondering how things were supposed to work out. And as it turns out, it worked out just exactly as God intended, because there's a time for everything. And the time that I needed was time for training. I needed time for discipleship. I needed time for learning and gaining knowledge. In the fullness of time delivered itself, and eventually I did get called by my first church. I was still on orders with the National Guard. Following Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, this church called me, and that became my first church in Port Barre, Louisiana. That's the story for next week if you want to tune in for that one. The house wasn't even ready for us to move in yet. It was still being remodeled. It was the most amazing thing. But in the fullness of time, it worked itself out. Because at just the right time, when I was ready, and my family was ready, and we were all ready, and the people of the town were ready, and God was ready, everything worked itself out just as it was supposed to, because there's a time for everything. Sometimes the time is just to learn patience. Sometimes the time is to struggle through. Sometimes the time is to callous yourself. Sometimes it's to fight the battles within. Sometimes it's to gain knowledge. We never know what the time brings to us, but God does. And it's in the fullness of time, God, not in the fullness of time, me or you. In the fullness of time, God delivered. And He will deliver for you just as much. Thanks for watching.